Sunny did get some rest after crafting the curse, most of his incarnations did, at least. A few more remained busy with other endeavors, handling tasks that never seemed to stop. Sunny had to admit, for a dead man, he was quite busy. One of his incarnations was setting up a base of operations in Ravenheart, for example. Another was developing spells meant to guard the citadels of humanity with Cassie. And lastly, just a day or two before Mordred rose to the throne of supremacy, one of Sunny's incarnations led the Shadow Legion into a decisive battle against the Black Millipede tribe. Out there, far north of the Dark City, the great tangle of the burned forest sprawled beneath the ashen sky. The charred mass of fallen trees was frothing and seething as it expelled a constant flood of something that looked like a black liquid from afar. It was not a liquid at all, though. Instead, the black flood consisted of countless chitinous bodies that crawled from underneath the broken trees like an unceasing torrent. Now that the battle moved close to the nests of the Black Millipede tribe, its 6 remaining queens threw everything they had into resisting the sinister invader, fighting for each meter of land with chilling cunning and ferociousness. Today, however, like every day for the last few weeks, the lethal flood of appalling millipedes had met its match. That was because a different plague had been spreading across the vast expanse of the charred tangle, hidden from view in its depths. The burned forest was suffering from a rat infestation. At first, there had been a single rat, the shadow of a rat, even. However, that one rat was no mere rat, it was the king of all rats, no less, in all its sacred glory. The Rat King had spread like a plague in the weeks after Sunny first summoned him to the burned forest, consuming the black millipedes slain by the Shadow Legion and gnawing on the blackened forest itself when there were none to devour. Once the number of rats grew enough, the sacred shade became capable of tearing them apart all by itself, which only increased the rate of its growth. By now, the flood of the grotesque millipedes was almost dwarfed by the seething ocean of rat bodies scurrying along the charred branches and broken tree trunks of the great tangle. It was as if 2 vile tidal waves collided in the middle of the burned forest, unleashing an awful cacophony of bestial screeches and visiting an unimaginable level of violence upon the world. An incalculable number of rats were torn apart by sharp mandibles, crushed by slithering chitinous bodies, and dissolved in powerful acid. At the same time, countless millipedes were shredded with tiny teeth, buried under a mass of vermin, and devoured from the inside. Sunny grimaced as he observed the battle from the towering remains of a burned tree, playing with a single rat that kept trying to bite his fingers off. What a distasteful sight. There was a dark smile playing on his lips. The Rat King was growing, which was good news, even if the strain of sustaining its existence was draining his reserves of essence more and more. Shades of his own rank or those who were weaker than Sunny provided him with more spirit essence than what was required to summon them, but sacred shades were different. Calling them forth from the dark expanse of his soul sea was strenuous both for his will and his essence, so he could only manage summoning one. But the Rat King was worth it here, in the burned forest, where it had an almost endless amount of relatively weaker enemies to feed on, not only because the number of rats constantly grew, but because it meant killing 2 birds with 1 stone. When the Rat King devoured black millipedes, its power increased. At the same time, the shades of the devoured millipedes joined the Shadow Legion, making it stronger as well. That was why the conquest of the southern outskirts of the burned forest was going even faster than Sunny had anticipated, despite the weeks of his absence. The millipede queens would not have allowed him to get this close to their nests if they were not struggling. Still, he had not won a battle yet. Each time the Shadow Legion advanced, it suffered a crushing defeat and had to retreat. Then, Sunny was forced to wait days until his shades were mended while escaping the pursuit of the great tyrants of the Black Millipede tribe, who had long understood that there was only one way to destroy the silent invaders, it was to kill and devour their lord. If only these poor creatures knew that there were 6 others just like him where he came from. Their struggle was hopeless. The Shadow Legion rose from the darkness over and over again, no matter how numerous times it was destroyed and wiped out. Worse still, it returned stronger and more numerous every time. After all, the millipedes who had fallen in each of the battles or had been consumed by the Rat King joined the ranks of the Silent Shadows. By now, the Ember Queen, the shade of the great tyrant of the Black Millipede tribe, ruled more members of their appalling kind than any one of her 6 remaining sisters did. Sunny inhaled deeply as he watched the tide of rats slowly drowning in the ocean of millipedes. The Rat King was struggling, it seemed. Far in the distance, the elusive forms of the 6 millipede queens were hidden behind the seething mass of their harrowing children. It's time. He looked around, suddenly missing the company of his other incarnation. Now that Sunny was alone, there was nobody for him to talk to, even. Of course, talking to his other incarnations was no different from talking to himself, so he could just do that. He sighed. Godspeed. With that, Sunny turned into a shadow. His shadow grew, enveloping the world. And then, a tenebrous army rose from it. The Black Millipede tribe might have surrendered a lot of ground to Sunny and his Shadow Legion, but it was still numerous and fearsome, beyond fearsome. In fact, for almost anyone except him, there was an endless sea of corrupted nightmare creatures, 6 great tyrants, and a deadly retinue of their powerful champions, great devils and enormous demons alike, their glossy black chitin decorated with vivid and eerie patterns. There were monsters, as well, some of them dozens of meters long. This harrowing force was enough to wash over Earth and consume every human populating its dying expanse. The Black Millipede tribe was far more terrible than the entirety of the nightmare creatures unleashed upon the world by the chain of nightmares in and of itself, except for the final few gate guardians, perhaps. But even then, the Millipede queens had numbers on their side. Sunny was facing the monstrous tribe alone. It was no coincidence that the Shadow Legion had suffered countless bitter defeats, and that even his own shadow shell had been destroyed by these sinister abominations more than a few times. However, it did not matter. Sooner or later, the Black Millipede tribe was going to become a part of the Shadow Legion, and their long string of victories would ultimately conclude with a final defeat. Sunny was just not sure that it would happen today. While the Rat King clashed with the great swarm of monstrous millipedes, the Legion of Death rose from Sunny's shadow. Saint appeared first, riding atop Nightmare. She regarded the scene of unimaginable violence with cold indifference, then raised her tenebrous sword and hit it twice against the rim of her shield. As if to answer, a sea of shadows rose from the darkness and surged forward. Then Shadow Legion split into 2 wings as it advanced. The left wing was commanded by Saint, who led the original shades into battle. Behind her were the shade of Dayron the Serpent King and his daughter, Windflower, the Snow Wolves of Ariel's game, the Azuras of Condemnation and other the supreme shades earned by Sunny in Godgrave, the shades of 7 song saints he had slain, twin shadows of Solvane, the powerful shades of those abominations he had killed in Antarctica, and others. Most of them were armed and armored by the dark weapons forged by the shadow of the King of Swords. The towering figure of blackened steel and infernal flame that was Fiend followed Saint into battle, as well. Serpent was also with her, flowing across the charred tangle like a river of onyx scales. The right wing of the Shadow Legion was a flood of black chitin, composed of numerous millipede shades. It was controlled by the Ember Queen, her ephemeral form hidden behind the seething mass of her monstrous soldiers. Slayer rode on the carapace of the elusive Supreme Tyrant, surrounded by wisps of ghostly fog. The Shadow Legion spread into a wide formation, moving past the dreadful slaughterhouse of the clash between the Rat King and the vast swarm of the monstrous millipedes. The 6 great tyrants moved their reserve forces, as well, sending the elites and champions of their grotesque kind to contend against the advancing shadows. Otherwise, the great army of their abominable tribe would be pincered and eventually surrounded, suffering terrible losses and losing the ability to retreat if need be. Nightmare rushed forward, covering hundreds of meters with each leap. The aura of dread surrounding him made the slithering millipedes cower, and Saint raised her sword, ready to reap their lives. Before she could, however, the burned forest was suddenly drowned in blinding light. Sunny felt the shadows shift and retreat, washed away by the beautiful radiance. Then, the roar of a devastating explosion rolled across the charred tangle, and a powerful shockwave sent clouds of ash flying into the sky. Directing his attention to the right flank of the battlefield, Sunny saw countless millipedes dissolving into a cold silver light. You have slain A. You have slain A. You have slain A. Standing atop the beautiful chiton of the Ember Queen, Slayer lowered her bow and regarded the devastation she had unleashed with dark malice. Moments before, she had poured her pure soul into the head of her arrow and let it fly. It was as if a falling star streaked across the ashen sky and landed in the carnage, obliterating both millipedes and the scurrying rats alike in the explosion of essence. So, the first kill of the battle was hers. Saint turned her head, as if looking at the murderous shadow across the vast distance of the battlefield. Slayer gave her a glance, as well, then calmly reached for another arrow. A moment later, Saint and Nightmare were among the millipedes. Her black blade lashed out, severing several monstrous abominations in half, while his hooves trampled a few more. The two armies collided, causing the entire world to quake. Fiend let out a bellowing roar, plunging into the mass of millipedes like a giant made of sharp steel and flame. Despite his enormous size, many of the elder abominations dwarfed him, their impregnable chitin parted under his claws, though, and plumes of smoke rose from the cracks in their carapaces, hinting that the grotesque horrors were being spurned from the inside. Serpent clashed with a colossal great devil, coiling around its long body and constricting it until the black carapace cracked, and a great flood of fetid blood was expelled from its maw. The shadow wolves descended upon the monstrous millipedes with the wild ferocity of primal predators. King Dayron led the shadows of the human saints into a deadly assault, the frigid winds raised by the shade of the winter beast howling as they froze and stiffened the bodies of the frenzied nightmare creatures. The battle entered a dreadful state of utter mayhem, with annihilating forces being unleashed by both armies to grind the other army to dust. Observing the carnage from a distance, Sunny remained calm. It seems to be going well. The right wing of the Shadow Legion, composed of slain millipedes, was more numerous than the left wing by now. However, while the millipede shades possessed great numbers and a startling amount of raw power, they had fewer exalted champions among their ranks. So, the situation at the opposite flanks of the battlefield was about even. Saint and Slayer seemed to be competing to see which one of them could slay more foes, though. As far as Sunny could tell, the results were far from conclusive. But both of them were terrors to behold. They are both doing well, too. Saint had assumed her true size, towering at 10 meters of height and wielding a similarly great blade. She was surrounded by a flowing whirlpool of true darkness, so Sunny could only occasionally catch glimpses of her. The shades under her command seemed to be fighting with a greater cohesion than the millipede shades under the Ember Queen's control, and she kept the front line stable by dashing here and there atop Nightmare, steadily pushing against the profane flood of monstrous abominations. Nightmare had changed in size to fit her new height, as well, becoming just as daunting to behold. In truth, that was no surprise. The tenebrous steed had been doing just that while carrying Saint all along, albeit on a more modest scale. He was a shadow creature, after all, and shadows were inherently shapeless. So, Sunny had a feeling that Nightmare took the shape of a horse by choice, not because it was inherently his form. Because of that, his size was merely a formality. Come to think of it. Observing the battle, Sunny allowed a minuscule fraction of his vast mind to get distracted for a moment. He knew that Slayer was a shadow creature born from the shadow of a mortal woman who had cast it once, a long time ago. What kind of creature had cast Nightmare, then? Sunny did not know, but in all his life, he had never met another creature wielding power over dreams. So, the original source of Nightmare must have been a singular existence. It had to be, to have cast such a shadow. Focus. Sunny told himself to focus, but really, he was not sure that there was a need. He was capable of concentrating on numerous things now, and there was no lack of attention he was paying to the raging battle. In fact, he was utterly devoted to experiencing and perceiving it in as much detail as he could. This was no ordinary battle, after all. This was the first major battle he fought after acquiring Mindweave. Therefore, Sunny was experimenting and testing himself, trying to see how far he could stretch the limits of his mind. At the moment, he was commanding thousands of shades at the same time. There was a certain gap between the speed with which he issued commands and the time it took the shades to comprehend and execute them, so he was slowly moving toward finding a flawless cadence, but generally, the combat effectiveness of the Shadow Legion had increased tremendously. It was not a disorganized mob of individual shades anymore. Instead, his silent soldiers fought like an actual army, a new and inexperienced army, perhaps, but a cohesive military force nonetheless. It was especially true because Sunny had two intermediaries helping him control the shades. Saint and the Ember Queen both served as conduits of his will and the generals of the Shadow Legion, lightening his burden and making his army respond better to his attempts to command it. There was still room for improvement, though. Saint is not quite there, yet. The taciturn Shadow was a truly fearsome presence on the battlefield, both because of her supreme rank and the Evening Star, which was being empowered by her own underworld armament. The black millipedes seemed to melt under her blade, and several of their champions had already been slain by the graceful Jade Knight. But although she possessed the War Master attribute now, she lacked the means of effectively communicating her authority to her soldiers, that would probably follow when she became a tyrant. The Ember Queen, meanwhile, could only command members of her monstrous tribe, which, needless to say, was a severe limitation. Think I have an idea of how to solve that problem. That would have to wait until the next time, though. For now, the Shadow Legion was performing well enough. It was even better than Sunny had expected. In the past, the millipede shades would be obliterated in a matter of minutes, and the rest of the Legion would soon follow, but this time, his silent soldiers were holding ground, giving the enemy as much hell as they were receiving. Even with the Rat King being slowly overwhelmed, the outcome of the battle seemed to be hanging in fragile balance, which was a far cry from the numerous defeats Sunny had suffered. The difference is impossible to miss. Now, he only needed to give the Shadow Legion a little push to break the balance in its favor. Stepping through the shadows, Sunny appeared in the very middle of carnage, next to Nightmare and Saint. He wrapped himself around the taciturn Shadow, took a mental breath, and activated the curse. The absence of light activated first, albeit it did not grant him much power due to the true darkness unleashed by Saint, but that was all right. Sunny did not need personal strength at the moment. The Shadow Flame activated next, allowing him to transfer a measure of his enhancement to any number of beings. Then came the Weakening Curse, branding the shadows of surrounding millipedes and draining off their strength. A moment later, the Mercy of Shadow poisoned their spirits with his death will. And finally, the Underworld Armament of the Jade Shell empowered the curse, making each of its effects more pronounced. A vast swathe of the black millipede swarm reeled. Countless abominations suddenly seemed slower, weaker, and less tireless than before. Many of those who had already been severely wounded simply fell to the ground, lifeless, the profane flames of their souls snuffed out by his killing intent. Of course, there were simply too many millipedes crawling across the charred surface of the great tangle for the curse to put a dent into their astonishing collective power. But it was just enough to break the stalemate and tip the scales of battle into the Shadow Legion's favor. And once Sunny gained that foothold, he could not be stopped. Sometimes, great things had small beginnings. The dark ocean of hungry rats infesting the burned forest had begun from a single beast, for example. Sunny himself, the Lord of Shadows, had been an orphan in the outskirts of Nosc once. A devastating rockfall could be caused by a single rolling pebble. Similarly, the curse did not immediately vanquish the Black Millipede tribe. In fact, its effect was not that significant when compared to the collective might of their profane kind. There were simply too many of them, and even the awesome power of a supreme titan was not sufficient to quell the monstrous swarm. However, if used at the right time and in the right place, it was enough to make a difference. Saint and the elites who followed her were facing the most fearsome champions of the Black Millipede tribe and the horde of lesser abominations who followed them. The Mercy of Shadow poisoned the souls of the nightmare creatures with the death will. Those of them who were weak and already wounded simply fell lifeless to the ground, creating gaps in the flood of abominations. Those who were too powerful to succumb to the killing intent of the Sovereign of Death still felt the cold grasp of his lethal authority, losing some of their vitality. Then, they were branded by the Weakening Curse and lost some of their power, as well. Both enchantments, as well as the Shadow Flame that allowed them to spread across the swarm of abominations, were naturally empowered by the Underworld Armament, as well. That was enough for Saint and her elites to push their advantage and bring several dreadful great nightmare creatures down in quick succession. Once the pillars of the millipede swarm's offensive in that section of the battlefield fell, an entire swath of the abominable flood collapsed under the eerily silent advance of the Shadow Legion. The louder the monstrous millipedes screeched and growled, the quieter the merciless shades seemed to become. The abominations died all the same. And the more of them died, the more shades there were to continue the slaughter. That small victory swiftly snowballed into a complete collapse of the black millipede swarm. The breach in their slithering mass allowed Saint to cut deep into the vast sea of abominations and attack other powerful champions from the flanks while her soldiers pushed the advance from the front. Before too long, these great nightmare creatures fell like dominoes, as well. And soon after they fell, the entire west-hem flank of the millipede swarm fell apart. The left wing of the Shadow Legion advanced, slaughtering countless abominations and threatening to encircle those of them who were battling the Rat King from the west. If the center of the millipede swarm fell, its eastern third would find itself being attacked by Slayer and the Ember Queen from the south while Saint and her forces descended upon them from the west. It would be utter devastation for the Black Millipede tribe. More importantly than that, Saint could choose to bypass the remaining two-thirds of the great swarm entirely and instead push north, where the millipede queens and their dreadful bodyguards were hiding behind the endless ranks of their revolting army. In the very heart of the slaughter, the corpses of the slain millipedes had formed a tall hill. With the battle still raging around it, Nightmare tore his way to the top of that hill and froze there for a few moments, blood dripping from his fangs as his eyes burned with terrifying crimson flames. Saint sat in his saddle, regarding the scene of unimaginable carnage with cold indifference. She studied the mayhem around them and then cast her tenebrous gaze into the distance, where the elusive forms of the millipede queens were hidden behind the sea of abominations. Her gaze seemed to carry the promise of death in it. Somewhere else on the battlefield, Fiend took a deep breath and then leaned forward while opening all four of his arms wide. A great torrent of roaring flames exploded from his infernal maw, incinerating hundreds of lesser millipedes and melting their black chitin into sludge. Not too far from him, Serpent had assumed the form of the Ember Queen, sowing confusion in the ranks of the millipedes. The elusive form of the great abomination was immediately besieged by countless foes, but escaped their claws and mandibles by hiding in the fleeting moment between the present and the future. A great demon fell, brought down by the twin shadows of Solvane. Someplace else, King Dayron and the shadows of Song's saints were surrounded by a vast field of shattered black chitin. The Shadow Wolves and the Azures of Condemnation were rampaging in the reeling swarm. On the other side of the battlefield, Slayer had leapt into the mass of monstrous millipedes and assumed the form of the wolf. Her jaws snapped, tearing the throat of a gargantuan great devil open, and then a chilling howl rolled across the battlefield, drowning out its deafening clamor for a few haunting moments. What will they do? Seeing the world through Saint's eyes, Sunny regarded the distant forms of the six great tyrants. The millipede queens seemed to linger for a while, observing the horrifying carnage in front of them. Their monstrous children were dying in scores every moment, and the losses were only continuing to mount. Finally, a strange ripple spread through the abominable swarm. Acting as one, the countless millipedes dove into the cracks between the blackened branches of the fallen trees, receding into the depths of the tangle like a frothing sea of black chitin. The black millipede tribe was retreating. Aha! Sunny extricated himself from Saint and stepped onto the surface of the morbid hill of slain abominations, watching the swarm recede with an arrogant expression. He closed his eyes for a few moments, and then inhaled deeply. Finally. After more than a year of war, the black millipedes had suffered their first defeat. And after suffering defeat for more than a year, he finally achieved the first victory. The first, but not at all the last. It had taken Sunny more than a year to defeat the Black Millipede tribe on the battlefield for the first time, but after that first victory, it only took him a week to bring their vile kind close to extinction. Such was the sinister nature of the Shadow Legion, it grew stronger every time it was defeated, and it grew even more after a decisive victory. A great number of monstrous millipedes, including some of their most powerful champions, had fallen in that last battle, and all of them fought under his banner now. Even if shades of the supreme and higher ranks did not possess the will and were therefore not as powerful as the beings who had cast them, it was still an obstacle that the wounded Black Millipede tribe could not overcome anymore. After all, the very reason they lost the battle was that the Shadow Legion had grown to a point where they could not defeat it. Perhaps if the Millipede Queen had committed to an all-out offensive and entered the battle themselves, they could have still reversed the result. But even then, it would have only postponed the inevitable. Maybe there were creatures deeper in the burned forest who could permanently erase shades from existence or possessed unholy powers to counter the Shadow Legion in some kind of way, but the Black Millipedes simply did not possess such tools. So, they were doomed. Sunny spent a few days after the battle recovering the soul shards from the corpses of the Millipedes, finally, and waiting for the destroyed shades to be mended in the lightless flames of his soul. The Dark Embrace enchantment of the curse accelerated the process, allowing his army to be restored faster, so he did not have to wait as long as usual. In the meantime, Slayer was secretly tracking the retreating swarm to its nests. She moved unseen, using her keen senses and transcendent ability to stalk the retreating swarm from a distance, and that was how the Millipede queens themselves revealed the location of their nests to Sunny, painting targets on the map. Once the Shadow Legion recovered most of its strength, he led his army north, wrapped around Saint and riding Nightmare at the head of a vast river of rats. In truth, Sunny was glad to leave the battlefield behind, albeit it made recovering the soul shards much easier. Watching the Rat King feast on the dead Millipedes for days on end was quite a revolting sight. The Black Millipede tribe tried to defend its territory fiercely despite the hopelessness of their struggle. The Millipede queens attempted to battle the Shadow Legion a few more times, but every clash ended in their decisive defeat, each one more obliterating than the last. When frontal battles proved to be impossible to win, they switched to different tactics, staging fierce ambushes and embroiling Sunny and his shades in countless small-time skirmishes. That strategy proved to be more troublesome, but still failed to stop his advance. In all honesty, Sunny had to give the Millipede queens some credit. He had rarely met nightmare creatures capable of such a high level of control over themselves. Nightmare creatures rarely retreated, let alone implemented complex strategies, even if there was no chance of surviving their demented attacks. But even that could not help the Black Millipede tribe. The ambush had failed to stop the advance of the Shadow Legion, and constant skirmishes had failed to stop it, too. In the end, their resistance was entirely broken. The last major battle the Millipede queens gave was when the Shadow Legion reached the first of their 7 nests. After being decimated there, the Millipede swarm broke and fled, never to assemble again. Sunny burned the nest and sent his shades, as well as the Rat King, on an all-out hunt. Over the next few days, countless Millipedes were pursued and slaughtered in the depths of the charred tangle. Sunny himself, meanwhile, continued to pursue the Millipede queens with the core force of elite shades. With the help of Slayer, he never lost their trail. 5 more nests were destroyed before he reached the final one. Sunny had expected the Millipede queens to defend it to their last breath, and was prepared to lay a deadly siege. However, in the end, he conquered the final nest and laid claim to his second citadel without any battle at all. He never got to kill the remaining great tyrants either. In the depths of the final nest, he found half-devoured carcasses of 5 of the 6 Millipede queens. It seemed that, when facing extermination, they had sacrificed themselves to feed their very essence to the 7th one. That final queen then fled north with a small brood of young Millipedes, abandoning her nest and escaping from Sunny into the depths of the burned forest. He did not know what would happen to her and her vile ilk. Far more terrifying beings inhabited the core of the burned forest, after all, and creatures like that rarely welcomed weaker abominations invading their territories. Perhaps the last Millipede queen would be devoured by a powerful nightmare creature, becoming the end of the Black Millipede tribe. Perhaps she would be able to flee far north and establish herself on a new territory, then spread like a plague once more. In any case, with the escape of the last Millipede queen, the war against the Black Millipede tribe was over. Having expanded the Shadow Legion greatly, Sunny had finally conquered the southern outskirts of the former Heart Realm. He had won. Victory sure tastes sweet. Riding Nightmare across the eastern quadrant, Sunny smiled. He had tasted defeat too many times in the burned forest, so this eventual triumph washed away the bitter taste from his mind. Of course, there was plenty of land left to conquer in the burned forest, its outskirts in other cardinal directions, its heartland, the titanic stump of the World Tree. But that would come in time, no doubt. For now, he had other things to worry about. Cresting a low hill, Sunny stopped Nightmare and looked ahead, a complicated expression appearing on his face. I've made it. In front of him was the